And now it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Drew Keratin. Drew is Professor of Law Emeritus at the University of Oklahoma College of Law. Some time ago, when we were starting our state checklist project, he joined in very graciously, put together 2 state checklists for us, one on Oklahoma where he lives and one on Puerto Rico, and he's going to tell us how that came to be. We have state checklists now for many of the states as well as the territories. Drew came to me and said, I think people would be interested in knowing how I went about it and the fun that I had doing a checklist. And I said, well, let's see. And sure enough, we got a lot of folks that were interested. And so now it's my pleasure to introduce Drew Keratin.
Okay, I want to thank everybody who has signed up. I'm going to share my screen. Oops, I got to get out of some things. Where am I? Right here. Okay.
So you were telling us about getting started. So would you continue?
Okay. Anyway, as I got into, I learned that you could collect topically, and I had never known that. And so I got very interested in the topical collection. And I joined the American Topical Association to learn about topical collection. And in one of the first issues of the Topical Times, I saw they were asking for volunteers for the checklist. And I said, well, I want to be helpful and I want to be involved. So I'm going to volunteer. And so I volunteered for Puerto Rico and Oklahoma. Oklahoma, of course, because I live here. Puerto Rico, because I was just interested. But when I volunteered, I thought, well, this is just going to be a sort of a, a listing, and I will just put it together for them, and that'll be very helpful, but it won't really be anything more than a kind of a listing. And instead, I discovered that it was a fascinating task because it taught me so much about Puerto Rico, and it allowed me in an unanticipated way to put together a small collection related to Puerto Rico. So as soon as I realized that this was going to be much more than just kind of putting together a list of stamps, I realized I needed to read some philatelic literature related to Puerto Rico. So this slide shows you 2 of the main sources that I read. One was from an American philatelist back in 1939, and the other one was the Philatelic Catalog of Puerto Rico by Hugo Storer, and from 1957. So I read this literature and I discovered that Puerto Rico has a fascinating philatelic history that required me to make a number of decisions as to what to include in this checklist. And that's because, as this next slide shows, Puerto Rico was a colony of Spain. It was a colony of Spain from the time Spain claimed it in 1493, all the way through the Spanish-American War in 1898. And Puerto Rico used Spanish colonial stamps from 1855 through 1898. And these 3 stamps are examples of Spanish colonial stamps. The first stamp is the red stamp is Alfonso XII, who was the King of Spain from 1874 to 1885. He died at the end of 1885 before his son was even born. The second stamp, the brown stamp, is a stamp of Alfonso XIII, who from his birth in 1886 to his abdication in 1931 was the King of Spain. And this is an example of a stamp showing him as a child, and it was the Spanish stamp used in Puerto Rico. The third green stamp is a stamp that shows a tax, a war tax that Spain issued to help finance the war that we call the Spanish-American War. Now, I did not include these 3 stamps or any Spanish colonial stamps on my checklist, because to do that would have turned the checklist basically into a geographical checklist, a checklist of stamps used in Puerto Rico. That wasn't the point of the checklist. The point of the checklist is to have stamps about Puerto Rico, not just simply geographically usable stamps. I wanted a topical collection about Puerto Rico, not a geographical checklist. So even though I purchased these stamps as part of my little collection, they're not on the checklist. And that's the same is true with the next series. When the United States then, by treaty at the end of the Spanish-American War, took possession of Puerto Rico, the United States overprinted U.S. stamps for use in Puerto Rico. The red stamp is the first overprint, and notice they spelled Puerto Rico, Puerto Rico. Porto is the correct word if you're using Portuguese. The second green stamp shows they switched to the correct Spanish, Puerto Rico. There's bound to be a story about why they started with a Portuguese overprint. Either it's because somebody didn't know Spanish, or it's because they actually thought that's the language they should use. I don't know that history. I don't know that story. It'd be a fascinating story, but I don't know it. I didn't include these stamps in my checklist either, for the same reason I didn't include the Spanish colonial stamps. U.S. colonial stamps is not the important point. I'm looking for a topical list, stamps about Puerto Rico. It turns out that these overprint stamps were from the period of 1898 through 1901, at which point the United States integrated Puerto Rico into the regular U.S. postal system. And from 1901 through today, Puerto Rico simply uses regular U.S. postage. But again, all those stamps are usable in Puerto Rico, but they're not on my checklist. But if you were a true Puerto Rican collector, you probably want to include all these Spanish colonial stamps and all these U.S. stamps, but that's not my ATA checklist, which is about Puerto Rico. Stamps related to Puerto Rico and stamps that are directly about Puerto Rico. And so that then gets us into, so these are not, these U.S. stamps, either overprints or since 1901 regular U.S. postage, are not on my checklist. What I began then, except for one exception relating to Spain, which I'll talk about in a few minutes, what I wanted again was stamps about Puerto Rico. And I have a checklist about Puerto Rico worldwide that has 163 items. And I have counted them and divided them really into 5 categories. And now I'm about to show you the first category. The first category is stamps related to Columbus, but not Columbus generally, Columbus that are specifically related to Puerto Rico. If I included stamps generally to Columbus, that'd be a Columbus checklist. Hundreds and hundreds of stamps. For example, Chile, for the first 40 years, only issued stamps with some image of Columbus on them. Well, Columbus is connected to Puerto Rico very heavily, but I'm not creating a Columbus checklist. I'm creating a Puerto Rico checklist. But this stamp meets that because this is the 500th anniversary, the cachet, of the landing Columbus in Puerto Rico in 1493, tied to a U.S. commemorative stamp in 1993 of the 500th anniversary. So this is truly a stamp about Puerto Rico from the United States. And so this is simply a first day cover. I think it's a nice first day cover. I'm very proud of it. and I purchased it as part of my small collection. Here's another example of the 1493 to 1993 U.S. commemorative 500th. But look at this cachet of all the explorers, early European explorers. It's got the Columbus voyages, the 5 Columbus voyages, but it's also got the voyages into Canada from Cabot and others. It's got other Magellan and other explorations in the New World, the European explorations. I just think it's an absolutely beautiful first day cover, and I bought it as part of my little collection. And this, of course, the first day covers are not on the checklist, but the stamp is. But I bought this as part of my little collection, and I would never have done that without having done this checklist. Here's another example. I told you that there's only one stamp from the Spanish period, which is on my checklist. That's because in 1893, Spain issued its only commemorative for Puerto Rico, the 400th anniversary of Columbus's landing in 1893. And if you bought the actual stamp, the original stamp, either in mint or non-mint condition, it's a stamp that's over $450. Most of them are selling for $475 to $500. That's beyond my budget that I'm willing to pay for a stamp. And so I saw an advertisement to pay $25 for a reproduction of a 1903 cover to Maya Gase, Puerto Rico. And so I purchased it. And when I got it, I said, oh my goodness, this is just a piece of paper. And I then went and looked at the seller's website and realized he almost only sells reproduction. These are just pieces of paper. This is totally worthless, in my opinion. Nobody would pay me a penny for this. On the other hand, I said, well, did I get $25 worth of pleasure where I can talk about this to the ATA tonight? And the answer is yes. So I got $25 of pleasure, but all he's doing is somehow reproducing the stamp, making a copy, pasting it to this fake cover. And I wrote him and said, how and why did you do this? And he wrote back and said, a person like me does not reveal their secrets. And I said, okie doke, that's very interesting. But this one stamp at least shows you what the Spanish commemorative looks like. By the way, he advertised this clearly and fairly as a reproduction, but it's just literally a piece of paper. And so this shows you, though, what the Spanish stamp looks like. That one Spanish stamp is the exception from the Spanish colonial period, and it is on my checklist because it is about Puerto Rico. Now, if you were to ask how many stamps are in this Columbus category, from the way I count, the answer to that is there are 48 Columbus stamps on my checklist, Columbus directly related to Puerto Rico. Now, let's move on. The second category of stamps that I counted of my 162 is what I call the historical category. It's historical figures, historical symbols, historical places, historical events. There are 38 stamps that I counted as part of the history of Puerto Rico. And the first day cover on your screen is the very first U.S. stamp about Puerto Rico. It is part of the Territorial series of 1937 U.S. commemoratives. It shows the fort of La Fortaleza. The other two stamps in that Territorial series related to the Virgin Islands and the Canal Zone. So this is the very first stamp the U.S. issued that is related directly to Puerto Rico. Notice the cachet is the El Morro Castle in San Juan Harbor. And the Spaniards built 3 fortifications to protect that harbor: La Fortaleza, the stamp; El Morro Castle, the cachet; and a smaller fortification called El Castillo, the little castle. There's no stamp, and I haven't seen any cachet that relates to it. But I think this is a nice Puerto Rican first day cover, the first U.S. stamp related to Puerto Rico. Here's another U.S. commemorative that relates directly to Puerto Rico. It's Ponce de Leon. I think this is a beautiful first day cover with the Colorado silk cachet showing his a banner and his motif, his image, visage. But I love this stamp. I think it is a great stamp issued in 1982. It's a U.S. commemorative for Ponce de Leon. But notice, if you look, the stamp is facing you. So if you look to his right shoulder, you notice there is a map of Puerto Rico. And then to his left shoulder is Florida. And in effect, the U.S. postal commemorative says Ponce de Leon is the bridge between Puerto Rico and Florida, the U.S. mainland, because Ponce de Leon was the governor of Puerto Rico in 1513 when he set off on the expedition to Florida. He came back for a second expedition in 1521 with the intent to establish Spanish colonies in Florida. He got to Florida and was wounded in a battle. Shortly thereafter, they shipped him back to Havana, Cuba, and he died shortly thereafter from his wounds in Puerto Rico. So he was a bridge from Spanish colonies, Puerto Rico, to U.S. mainland, Florida, twice, 1513 and 1521. And I just think that's a fantastic stamp. Here is a first day cover that relates to Ponce de Leon. Notice there's the Ponce de Leon stamp and then the 1937 U.S. Territorial stamp. But look at that first day cover. It is the depths of the sea. It's sea currents with a map of Puerto Rico and the islands that relate to Puerto Rico, Vieques and Culebra. And then it's got the U.S. Virgin Islands too. That is a fantastic cover. I think it's just gorgeous. And I bought it as part of my little collection, which I would never have done without having gotten excited and interested in this ATA collection. As I said, there are a total of if I can find it again, there are a total of 38 stamps that relate to what I call the history. Now, here's another one relating to history. And this is the commemorative stamp with the peasant and the wheel and the ballot. This is obviously a 3-cent a block of 4, issued in 1949, when Puerto Rico changes from being a directly ruled U.S. colony, where the United States government appoints the governor, to the first elected governor of Puerto Rico, when Puerto Rico becomes a Commonwealth of the United States. And Luis Munoz Marin is elected the first governor in 1949. Now, what does it mean that Puerto Rico is a Commonwealth of the United States? Well, it's not a territory. It is not en route to becoming a U.S. state. Now, Puerto Rico could vote to change that, but they haven't done that yet. It's a Commonwealth affiliated with the United States. As a Commonwealth, it does not have any electoral votes in U.S. elections for president. It does not have any U.S. senators, but it does send one non-voting U.S. delegate. And because it's a Commonwealth possession, you acquire citizenship in the United States by birth, which means Puerto Ricans to travel to and from the United States or settle in the United States. They are U.S. citizens by birth, but they're not on the route, which is what territories are, not on the route to becoming part a state of the United States. They are Commonwealth. I won't go into it, but U.S. actually has several Commonwealths around the world. Notice the cachet. Notice it's Luis Munoz Marin. They misspelled Munoz. It's M-U-N-O-Z, and they spelled it M-U-N-O-S. Americans apparently have trouble with foreign languages. But anyway, that's a really interesting cachet, which I bought, or a first day cover. Here's another one, honoring the first female governor of Puerto Rico in 2001. And this is her inauguration cachet and her slogan, peace, unity, and the future. But what I like about it also is for her inauguration day, it's tied to a commemorative of the first governor, Luis Munoz Marin. Notice this time they got the spelling of Munoz correct. And so I just think that's a fantastic first day cover. And so I bought it again as part of my little collection. Now, as I say, then if we move on, my second category is famous persons. My third category is famous persons. My first was Columbus, my second was history. My third category is famous persons. There are a total of 19 stamps in my 162 that relate to famous people from Puerto Rico. Well, I'm a great baseball fan. I love baseball as much as anything. And so I chose the commemorative stamp for Roberto Clemente, a first day cover, which says athlete and humanitarian. And so this is a stamp of Roberto Clemente, the great right fielder for the Pittsburgh Pirates. He played from 1954 to 1972, 19 years in the MLB. He is the first Latin American player in the Baseball Hall of Fame. I think he's the greatest right fielder of all time, but that's Drew Keratin's baseball opinion. It's like putting together a checklist for Puerto Rico. You can interpret and do things differently. You're entitled to your own opinions. But I was a Roberto Clemente fan from 1954 to 72. He is on 6 stamps around the world. Here I show a stamp from from Nicaragua. It's part of a series of famous Latin American baseball players. He's part of that series, but Nicaragua honored him for another reason. He died on December 31, 1972, as he was leading a humanitarian mission in a plane he had rented and filled to bring relief goods, relief medicines to Managua, Nicaragua, after it suffered the great 1972 earthquake, which killed thousands of people. His plane crashed shortly after takeoff from Puerto Rico into the Caribbean Ocean, and he was killed. The second item on your screen, the United States also issued a series of stamps called Legends of Baseball. Roberto Clemente was honored in that, but they took the US 20 stamp and turned it into a baseball card. That is a US postal baseball card. They did that for all the legends. I think there were 6 in the series, but of course I chose the one because it relates to Puerto Rico, Roberto Clemente. As I say, Roberto Clemente is on 6 stamps worldwide of the 19 famous persons from Puerto Rico. Here's another famous person from Puerto Rico, Arturo Alfonso Schomburg. He was born in Puerto Rico. The cachet, of course, highlights his connection to Puerto Rico because this is from Mayagüez, Puerto Rico. And notice his visage is on top of the Puerto Rican flag. And then there's the stamp. The stamp is actually not issued by the United States to honor Puerto Rico. It's part of the Black Renaissance, the Black Harlem Renaissance series. And he was a historian, an archivist, a great collector of books and literature and other things related to Puerto Rico and Black American history. He's being honored really as part of the Harlem Renaissance on the stamp. But the first day cover emphasizes his connection to Puerto Rico. He moved to the United States when he was 18 or 19 in the early 1890s, and the rest of his life was spent in Brooklyn, New York. But I love this cover. This is actually the last stamp that the United States has issued, 2020, that relates directly to Puerto Rico. It's Arthur Schomburg. And so I just think that's a wonderful stamp. My fourth category of stamps related to Puerto Rico is where Puerto Rico appears as a map on the stamp. And this is a stamp from Honduras. I have lived in Honduras. I love Honduras. But notice the stamp has nothing to do with Puerto Rico. It's about honoring the 150th anniversary of the establishment of the United States Constitution, 1937 and 1939, because the Constitutional Convention and enactment of ratification of the Constitution is 1787 to 1789. 1789, yes, so 150th anniversary. So this stamp has really nothing to do with Puerto Rico, but they put a map on it. If you look at the map, you'll notice you can see the Bahamas off the coast of Florida. You notice you see Cuba. You notice right below Cuba is Jamaica. Right next to Jamaica and Cuba is the island of Hispaniola, which is the Dominican Republic and Haiti. And notice off the coast of Hispaniola, the island is the island of Puerto Rico. There are, in fact, 38 such stamps that have Puerto Rico on a map, in which the stamp is not about Puerto Rico. But if you were looking for stamps about Puerto Rico, I think these maps on stamps count. And so there are 38 of these as part of my checklist. And there are a number of other stamps in my little, not a number, several other stamps that have this map of Puerto Rico that are part of my small little collection. Now, the next stamp goes back to the history, and this relates to Spain. Spain, of course, was the colonial power, as I said, from 1493 to 1898. Spain is very proud of having been related to Puerto Rico. And in 1972, issued a series of 4 stamps, all on this first day cover, all relate to Puerto Rico, and they emphasize the Spanishness, Hispanidad, the Spanishness of Puerto Rico, because Spain is still very connected to Puerto Rico through culture, language, religion, and settlement. So many, many people from Spain have settled in Puerto Rico. And so this stamp from Spain, as part of my worldwide checklist about Puerto Rico, this is one of my favorite stamps about Puerto Rico history, and it's from Spain. Now, one other stamp that's on my collection is private local postage. Aerovías Nacionales Puerto Rico was founded in the 1930s, and they required that you use their stamps for their planes to carry your letters between cities in Puerto Rico or between cities in Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands. The United States Post Office consistently argued that they should not do this, but it turned out they tolerated them. And Aerovías Nacionales Puerto Rico issued 2 different varieties of private local postage, 1938, 1941. And I have listed these on my checklist. I think these private local postage stamps are just fascinating. They're also part of my little private collection. Now, with that, I want to go and end by making some comments. As I prepared this talk for you tonight, I realized I had 2 gaps in my little private collection. One was revenue stamps. Well, revenue stamps are geographical, they're not topical, so they wouldn't be on my checklist, but for my little private collection, I would like to have some revenue stamps. Spain issued revenue stamps. The United States has issued revenue stamps. So I have now purchased them, but they didn't arrive in time for me to get them into my talk tonight. Probably good, because it reduced the time to show them. But I have now revenue stamps coming, but they wouldn't be part of the checklist. That's part of the geography. But a geographical lecture of Puerto Rico might say, hey, I want to have revenue stamps. As you can imagine, many of the revenue stamps relate to what? That wonderful product of Puerto Rico called rum. And so that's the second gap is, it's part of my categories and they are on my checklist. That's birds from Puerto Rico. There are 5 bird stamps, but I hadn't purchased any, and I don't show anything on when I give a talk unless I own it. I have now purchased some bird stamps. If I give this talk again, I'll have some bird stamps to show, but they're not shown because I don't own them yet. I have now purchased them. So I'm going to fill in 2 gaps. You taught me a bunch about my collection that I didn't even know until I put together this. I hope this shows you how I got fascinated with doing this talk, doing this ATA checklist of Puerto Rico, and how I've counted, how I've organized it, how I got fascinated, and how it led to a small little collection that I just enjoy. And with that, I thank you for listening. I'm going to turn it back to Bill.
Well, we thank you very much for your time this evening, and you have shared your email address. And so if people have further questions, clarifications, it was a very thoughtful and very complex subject that you took on, and we very much appreciate that. So if the rest of you have questions, please do not hesitate to email Drew and pursue your questions with him there. And thank you, Drew, for a very enlightening and very thoughtful presentation of how you sorted through the Puerto Rican world. And it's very much appreciated. So we're done for this evening. Thank you very much. Make sure you check with the American Topical Association website for future events. There are a lot coming up. And Drew, thank you again.
You're welcome.